Hola y bienvenidos a este video sobre los verbos irregulares en el condicional. Hello and welcome to this video lesson exploring irregular verbs in the Spanish conditional tense. Los retos de esta clase son recapitular qué es el condicional y cuándo lo usamos. So the goals of this lesson, the first one is to recap what the conditional tense is and when we use it. If you haven't seen anything about the conditional tense before, I recommend you go to my channel and watch my first video about the conditional tense. If you do know a little bit, in this video we are going to recap how regular verbs are conjugated in the conditional. We're then going to identify three groups of irregular verbs in the conditional tense, and that's the main learning objective of this lesson. Entonces, ¿qué es el condicional? What is the conditional tense? So it's used to express hypothetical ideas. We use it to express the idea that someone would, could, or should do something, or that something would, could, or should happen. Or algunos ejemplos, some examples. Viajaría a Perú. I would travel to Peru. Podría llamar a mi amigo. I could call my friend. Debería estudiar más. I should study more. So we've just done our first learning objective, which was to recap what the conditional tense is and when we use it. The next step is to recap how regular verbs are conjugated in the conditional tense. ¿Cómo se conjugan los verbos regulares? So how are regular verbs formed? How are they conjugated in the conditional tense? Well, first of all, we use the infinitive verb. We don't remove the ending, whether it's an AR, ER, or IR verb. We use the whole infinitive, and then we add our conditional ending to the infinitive. And also these endings, there's just one set of them, and we use them for all verbs, which makes the conditional really quite nice and easy. So here we're going to have a look at those endings. So we've got jugar, to play, representing our AR verbs, comer, which is to eat, representing the ERs, and seguir, to follow or to continue doing something, which is representing the IR verbs. So our endings are ia, ias, ia, iamos, iais, ian. And they're the same endings that we use with the imperfect tense, with ER and IR verbs. The difference here is that we're adding them to the infinitive, whereas to form the imperfect, we need to take the verb ending off. So it's an important thing to note so that you don't get confused between the conditional and the imperfect tense. So we've just done our second learning objective, which was to recap how regular verbs are conjugated in the conditional tense. So our next step is going to be to start with the main learning objective, which is to identify three groups of irregular verbs in the conditional. Los verbos irregulares, the irregular verbs. So there are 12 key irregular verbs in the conditional tense, which can be categorized into three groups. The first group are verbs whose infinitive ends in ER and their conditional stem loses that E. The second group, there are some ER and IR verbs in there, and the last vowel in the infinitive gets replaced with a D. The third group is only two verbs, it's decir and hacer, and there's no rule. You just have to learn those ones, but none of this is overly complicated. We're going to go through them group by group and look at the rules and look at how these verbs behave. Entonces, grupo 1. These irregular verbs end in ER and their conditional stem simply loses the E. So we've got caber, which means to fit. So we take out the E out of that and the stem becomes cabra. We then add our regular conditional ending to the verb as with the regular verbs. So caber, stem goes to cabr, we've removed the E, cabría. Yo cabría, and caber means to fit, so that's it would fit, or I would fit, or he or she would fit, because the first person and the third are the same in the conditional. Haber goes to abr, habría, poder goes to podr, podría, querer to quer, querría, remember to roll that R if you can, querría, and saber goes to sabr, which goes to sabría. So simply, these five verbs, we remove the E, then the rest is business as usual. Grupo 2. Estos irregulares terminan en ER o IR. So these irregular verbs in group 2 end in er or ir. The irregularity with them is that we take out the last vowel from the infinitive and we replace it with a d. So these are the 5 verbs. 3 of them are er and 2 of them are ir. So that e or I gets removed and in its place we add a d. So poner, to put, goes to pondría. Yo pondría, I would put. Salir goes to saldría. Tener goes to tendría. Valer, which means to be worth, goes to valdría. So there's a nice phrase actually, vale la pena. So that means it's worth it, almost like it's worth the pain. So if you wanted to say it would be worth it, you'd say valdría la pena. And finally, venir, which means to come, goes to vendría. Y por último tenemos el grupo 3. So in this group, as I mentioned before, there are only 2 verbs and they don't follow any pattern. So the verbs we've got are hacer, to do, and decir, to say. So the stem for hacer is ar, which goes to haría, haría, harías, haría, haríamos, haríais, harían, and decir goes to dir, diría. So you've just got to learn these, but there's only 2 of them. The other 10 fall into those nice 2 clear groups with very clear patterns that they follow. And thankfully, these are really high frequency verbs. So you hear them a lot, you come across them a lot, which makes them really easy to pick up and also gives you lots of opportunity to practice them. For example, diría que, I would say that, is a really good way to start an opinion. Instead of saying pienso que, I think that, you can say diría que, I would say that. And then you're using a sort of higher level conditional tense in your speaking. So that's the end of today's lesson. We've completed all of our lesson objectives. If you want to continue learning, our next steps could be to practice conjugating irregular verbs in the conditional tense. And I'd also recommend to you to watch my video on would, could, and should, because there are 3 different ways we use the conditional in Spanish. So head over and watch that video if you can, and muchísimas gracias por ver este video. Thank you very much for watching. Que te vaya muy bien con el español.